it says, أريد مساعد في جلب عائلتي في تركيا. أنا لا أستطيع أن أذهب سوريا بسبب الحرب. فقط أريد عائلتي is all I need is my family. It's like the last end of it. I actually bought this frame to put a picture of my family in it, to put on my desk, so it's, distressed wood and super trendy, and I thought it was going to be a great addition. And then I realized that this had to go with me everywhere I went instead. This note is the weirdest little bottom piece of paper ever. It's not cut straight, it's dirty, but I don't want anything to happen to it, so that's why I put it in this frame.
That's Tanya. And if you haven't listened to last week's episode, stop here and go back, because you'll want to know the backstory behind this week's transformation.
There's a leaf inside of it as well. And it's funny because I picked up that leaf earlier in the day when we were going to schools because the leaves were so beautiful. And I was like, wow, what a beautiful, beautiful fall in front of this school. Like, I don't want to forget this day, how cool it's been. And so I took this leaf. So when I got home and I put this in a frame, it was ironic because the way the day started and what I didn't want to forget, it was totally different than the way it ended.
Last week, we heard about how Tanya's worldview changed after going to Italy on a high school exchange program, and again when she came home, and then again when she studied abroad in the UAE.
When I finished my high school exchange, I thought I had changed. Past tense, full stop, the change, transformation is over. And again, perhaps arrogant, but I thought I had changed and that I was ready to take on our world. Just a few hours before I got on the plane at the end of my time in the UAE, so in January of 2014, I wrote in here that was one of the first moments that I recognized and admitted that I was still changing and that fate brought me to the Middle East, that I went to the UAE with the thought that it was a calling and a passion. I went to be a missionary and I left with a different calling.
After studying abroad in the Middle East and finishing college, Tanya had to make a tough decision about the role of Arabic in her life.
When it came time for my real person job or getting a career, it didn't quite feel like maybe this was the path I was going to pursue right away. I came to terms with knowing maybe I'll come back to it, but it wasn't going to be sort of the main heartbeat of my daily life anymore.
She found a job here at EF, and shortly after, she was sent to represent EF at one of their professional learning tours, which takes educators around the world to learn more about the education systems in other cultures. Tanya's tour went to Berlin, Krakow, and Prague.
It was already going to be an emotionally intense tour because we were going to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau. We get to Berlin, and our tour director is an incredibly observant and kind human.
The tour director's name was Aiden, and he volunteered at a refugee center in the city.
He remembered that I had spoke some Arabic or dabbled and asked me if I'd be willing to come with him to the refugee shelter to translate stories. And so I said, yes, okay, sure, I'll go with you. And we thought we would just scope and talk to these men.
The men Tanya's referring to were refugees. They came from places like Syria and Iraq, usually with no belongings and no place to go. So Tanya, along with Aiden and 2 others, took a detour to the shelter.
It was a little bit more off the beaten path. It was not a busy area, and it was an old school. It was very run down. It reminded me some of my high school in Italy, actually, in terms of the quality of the school. And it was lots of hallways, and I think they had families and groups of people into the different classrooms. They didn't have enough room constantly.
Multiple sources report that Germany took in about 1 million refugees and asylum seekers in 2015.
There was the staircase and the welcome desk, and then the only other place that we really saw was the cafeteria, which was some tables in an open room. We walked in. Aiden was kind of, negotiating, if you will, in German with the people to let us in because it is a closed place and he's a volunteer there, so he can come and go. But who were these 3 American strangers trying to walk into this shelter? This woman walks down the stairs. She's just a cute old little Arab woman, and she's traditionally clothed. So she's wearing an abaya, which is, the traditional robe, if you will, that's black, and then her shayla or her hijab over her hair. And she comes down the stairs, and for some odd reason, I turn to her and say good morning in Arabic, and she says it back, and like her eyes just lit up. And I don't know, just kind of in my soul, I realized someone probably hasn't said good morning to her in her native language in weeks. So that was kind of the beginning. That's when I knew I was in for an emotional ride for the rest of the day.
Eventually, Aiden was able to convince the shelter to let Tanya talk to the men about sharing their stories.
I don't know if they magically joined us. I actually can't remember, but they were all there, the 3 or 4 of them. And just hearing a bit of where they're from, what they used to do, where they're from, who they're there with. And we just sat there for maybe 20 minutes.
And in that 20 minutes, Aiden made a plan. EF hosts a live storytelling event for their Berlin learning tours. So after the main storytelling event, the men would go before the audience and speak in their native Arabic, and Tanya would translate their stories into English, live.
This was something he made up on the fly. He thought if we went in and talked to these men and encouraged them to join us later in the evening, that we could tell their stories to our entire group, all the educators with us. I would do my best to translate and share in the most appropriate way. And then, of course, we would have kind of tea, coffee, and little desserts, and we would love to have them join us. But we were just guessing, so he hadn't really put much organization into it. We wanted to make sure they understood the location and time, so I grabbed a piece of paper at the front desk and tried to scribble it in Arabic to make sure that it was written somewhere that we did in fact want them to join us. And we left the note at the front desk and walked out and just really hoped they'd show up. So I allowed myself a little moment of freak out. I was with my colleague Colin, and he still laughs about this all the time to this day, when I kind of was panicking and made sure that I could look up a couple more words. I mean, I live a very privileged life that I didn't need to know some, what's the word, emotional or drastic words in Arabic, so I looked them up so I could be prepared. I didn't want to do a disservice to these individuals by telling their stories or talking to them and not having the words. And so maybe that's a little bit of a self-serving thought of being like, am I good enough for them? But that was what was running through my head is, wow, this is way more than I was expecting. Am I going to be able to do what they need me to do? It was just like kind of, I don't know, whenever it's raining super hard and you're driving and so your whole body tenses up and then you get so tired at the end of it. It was like my whole body was tensed up because I didn't know what to expect or what would happen. Everything that I had done for Arabic was about me and my understanding of the part of the world I didn't know before, or me wanting to learn a third language and be totally different than my upbringing, or wanting to be in a risky situation. It was always about Tanya. It was always about me. And it wasn't anymore. I had 4 hours to immediately turn around the last 4 or 5 years interacting with Arabic to not be about me, but to be about these men and whose stories would have, made me lose it in my own language, let alone hearing it in the language of their heart and having to translate it back out. And then we're in the train and we're on our way to this cafe that the rest of our educators, our travelers, would be there with us and hope that these men showed up. And I had written a bunch of different words down and I was like sitting on the train trying to make sure I could remember them. So it was a cafe that's actually on the dead zone where the wall used to be in Berlin. And this was a part of the tour. We present sort of a conversation between the two sides of the Berlin Wall and what it was like to be raised on either side. It was kind of a small, intimate cafe, very dimly lit, and we packed in all of our educators, all of our travelers. The women were going to go first. There was a woman for each side of the wall. And I remember just sitting in the back corner, and I turned to Colin and I said, do you think they'll come? And no quicker than me saying that, the door opens and like 6 or 7 of them walk in. Most of them we had met earlier. A couple we hadn't met before. There was someone who was younger. The way he sort of was carrying himself was different than the other men. You know, the closed position of kind of keeping his arms wrapped around himself and very closed off. Come to find out, 17 years old, so much younger than me. He just sat down with the rest of the group. Really stuck to himself, didn't say a single word. I never heard him speak. And he stayed that way the entire night. I finally asked one of them, who is this? And he said, oh, he just got here. He had literally just gotten to Berlin hours before and couldn't get into the shelter because, like I said, the shelter was super packed and he didn't have all his papers prepared. So he had nowhere to go that night. So they just brought him to the cafe with us. He did do the walk like a lot of the other men did. He walked all the way up to Berlin.
The walk Tanya's referring to is something a lot of refugees go through. While there's no set route from Syria to Germany, there are common routes people take. This included going from Syria to Turkey, taking a boat, if you could get one, to Greece, walking up through Macedonia, and following the route through Serbia, Hungary, and Austria, all the way up to Germany. Sometimes on a bus, sometimes by train, but most of the time on foot.
Next thing you know, I'm sitting on like this back bench of a cafe, just completely surrounded by all these men. They start talking about their lives and are so interested in the fact that I know some Arabic and why do I know some Arabic, showing me pictures of their family on their Facebooks and adding me on their Facebooks. I think we were probably a little rude too because the women were talking about their stories. And we were just trying to get an understanding of each other and it kind of made me feel good because for some reason they trusted me. Or rather, I thought they trusted me, so I knew, okay, I can make this work somehow.
One of the men began showing her pictures of his children, who were still in Iraq.
Look how cute his son is. He's so little. It's just like a classic 3-year-old, just kind of like gawking at the world, eyes big, mouth open, just like sitting. I don't know where he's at, but he looks a lot like his dad. His dad was a smaller man from Iraq, like very tiny frame, like very clearly very skinny. And he had all these kids in Iraq. And so this is a picture of his youngest that he showed me. And then he showed me this picture of his other kids, like by a fence. And he was so proud of this picture. He was so proud of kind of one of his older kids and one of the girls. And here they are like all in their jackets and mittens because it's really cold in Iraq, actually. And he was so proud of showing me this picture, but it also kind of hurt me because you don't usually see children who look so sad in pictures. Like, that's a blessing that we have, that most pictures are kids elated or something jokingly their parents posting of them being upset about not getting a cookie or something. But the look on his kid's face in this, he was so proud to show me it, but it was also just so heartbreaking because I don't know, I can't even put into words, but at that point I had to kind of get over myself and say, whatever happens, happens. It's not about you. It's not about you not looking good in Arabic. It's about them and doing the best you can to share their stories. Also just sitting around them and kind of joking about sort of their kids or sharing a bit of their stories. And knowing that I was completely comfortable being surrounded by 8 or 9 Arab men. And some people in the room noticeably weren't as comfortable. I knew it was my responsibility to just like get over myself and go do it. So when the women finished, it was go time, and Colin turns to me and like pats me on the back. He's like, "You got this. Come on, bud. You got this." And made sure the men had kind of coffee or tea and had everyone situated, and everyone sat back down. And I like grabbed my little paper with my vocab words one more time. And then I stood up there next to them, and we just started going. started sharing stories one at a time.
The men began to tell their stories in their native Arabic, and Tanya, the 24-year-old girl from the Midwest, the girl who had never met anyone from the Middle East until she was 18, the girl who hadn't even thought of a life outside of Missouri until she read that article in 17 magazine, began to translate these refugee stories for a full house of people. And while each story was tragic, there was one in particular that really caught Tanya off guard.
The man who showed me the picture of his children has quite a few children. He has 7 kids. And he had to leave them, obviously, because they're babies. You can't travel from Iraq to Germany with babies. And so he left them. And I think it's so important for people to realize that refugees aren't from like some desolate part of the world without technology. Like, he had an iPhone, he had a Facebook. That's what he's showing me these pictures on. And he had been in contact with his family for a lot of time via Facebook, via some form of internet. And he was telling me that he had actually lost connection with them a week or two back. And he lived in the part of Iraq where kind of ISIS was making its way through things. So that was a really rough start to the story, to tell people that he left his children there and his wife, and he hasn't heard from them. So then he starts to tell the story about going there, and he gets to the sea, and this is another, popularized scene in the news of people taking those little dinghy boats across the sea. And maybe we've become too familiar with it, but this guy didn't even have that option. He waited for a boat, and there was no boat. And so he waited again, women and children first. And he finally realized, if I don't go, I have to go. I don't really know. So he swam across the sea. And the first time he said it, I asked him to repeat it because I knew I had mistranslated. I was like, there is no way you swam across the sea. And then he said it again, and I knew that word, and I turned to the younger gentleman who did speak a little more English, and I was like, did he just say he swam? He's like, yeah, I did. So he swam and then continued walking once he got to Europe all the way to Germany, and had been in Germany for a couple months. The more painful part of sort of this whole experience was we allowed our travelers, our educators, to ask questions. And of course they're curious, but their questions just killed me to ask because I knew the answer, and it was so sad. It was, had you heard from your family? Or what's it like been getting settled in Germany? Have you learned German? And his answers were, I can barely think straight in Arabic right now. I really can't learn German. I'm trying, but I'm not there. And of course, he hadn't heard from his family for a couple weeks. I kind of shut that one down. I didn't want us to go any further about that because he had just showed me all these pictures, and I didn't want to put him through having to potentially bring up what is the inevitable. I told myself that I didn't have the right to cry, that it was not about me and my emotions that night, it was about them. And so I didn't cry. And I told their stories, and one of them wrote me this note, and it's on the back of my work document. And he wrote it in really simple Arabic because he's like, I don't want you to ever forget this or not understand it. And he left first, and then I read the note. أريد مساعد, which is I need help. في جلب عائلتي, with getting my family. في تركيا, from Turkey. أنا لا أستطيع أن أذهب سوريا. He says that he can't go back to Syria بسبب الحرب, because of the war. But all he needs, فقط أريد عائلتي, is all I need is my family. It's like the last end of it. And I look at Colin, and he said, are you okay? And I just completely lost it. And the men were all gone at this point, which is good. And I just cried because I realized that I have no idea what to do with anything that happens. I was 24 years old, just started my first real job, and I just all of a sudden questioned so many things about our world.
then there was also the 17-year-old boy who had just made it to Berlin that same day.
And when we had gotten through all the stories, when we finally had shared everything that people wanted us to share, I went over to the front of the cafe and asked the couple that owned it if they could just give me the biggest piece of a pastry that they had left, and I brought it over to him, and he just scarfed it down. It was incredible. And so then we talked to Aiden about it and realized there was no place in the shelter for him that night. So Aiden gave up his hotel room in the hotel where we were staying with our educators. And of course, on the way back, we stopped at Burger King that was in the hotel and bought him the equivalent of 3 meals and just kind of let him, I guess, pretend he was okay for a night, staying in a nice hotel in the middle of Berlin with a meal. It was actually, I hate using the word traumatizing. I wish there was a different word. It was very moving experience to walk with him from where we were to the hotel, because he was just done with life. He was just done. He was tired, and he would be sitting by himself, and occasionally he would shake because he's tired or cold, or laugh, get something. I don't know, right? But I had never seen someone have to go through that at such a young age. And then we get him to the hotel, and the thing that mattered so much to me, and I knew telling their stories made a difference, was the travelers, the educators that stayed and listened to the stories, actually collected money and gave all their hotel soaps and money, all their euros, in a little bag, and left it for him so that he could have something to start with in his new life. I didn't know what to talk about or who to talk to about it, so I didn't. I went back to the hotel, and I had this note, and I was sitting there and looking at it, and I was like, okay, I have to stop looking at this. This is going to wreck me. And I went into the bathroom, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I, again, just couldn't look at myself, because what a privileged life I had, that at 16, I went to Italy, and I was at the university that I went to, and I was living my dream, that I was in Berlin as a tourist for my job. And here I had to sit next to someone who was 17 and was a shell of themselves.
All of a sudden, Tanya, who grew up in the church, who at one time wanted to be a Christian motivational speaker and another time a missionary, found her faith being shaken.
I had no idea what this meant for God at all. Being born and raised in the church, I had no idea how a God could exist, that this was happening. Or what. I actually remember talking to myself in my hotel room. Probably sounded really crazy, but I was just like, if you're real, God, is this real? Why don't you do something? Why do I get to have the life I have, and this is what they're going through? When I got back to the US, I called my parents. And it was my first work trip, so they were so excited, and they wanted to know about this and that, and my flight. They've never been out of the country, so they ask kind of simple, fun questions. Then I started to tell them this story, and I told my mom that I didn't really know what to think about religion anymore, and that I didn't know what to think about all of it. And my mom cried, and my mom's kind of an emotional person, but the way she cried that time was a bit different than usual. And I don't really remember how the conversation ended, but it ended. We didn't talk about it anymore. I went on. So this was probably in November that I talked to her.
Tanya went back home to Missouri for Christmas, not too long after that phone call with her mother. And after all these years away at college and abroad, she felt even more out of place in her community and church.
Wasn't super jazzed about going home because I hadn't been to my home church in years. I don't even know the last time I went there. But they had a Christmas Eve service, and my dad really wanted us to go. He really wanted us to go as a family. So my siblings and their spouses and myself, we were like, okay, we'll go. So we show up. This is a church that I've been in since I was a little kid. I was Jesus in the manger. I was Mary. I was a shepherd. I was everything at this church. And I met this woman, again, who I've known since I was probably 8 or 9. And she starts talking to me about my life, and she's like, "It's so great to see you. You've all grown up." It's pretty crazy. Your mom was telling me that you really got into Arabic. And where did that come from? That seems kind of random. And we talked a little bit more, and then she said, and your mom was telling me the story about the refugees. And I have to be honest, the first thing I did was tense up, like ready to be in defense of something. But instead she said, I never thought about that. I never really thought about that perspective and how we probably should be doing more and how we really should be opening our doors. And it was like everything I knew about my town completely changed. I teared up, tried to hold it together. My mom comes up next to me, wraps her arm around me, and she was like, "Oh, you saw Tanya again." And I don't know if that moment was profound for anyone but me, and it was very brief, but I realized that everything that had happened in my life since I was 16 years old had cycled all the way back to that same church. And because my mom had shared the story with someone else, they all of a sudden realized there was more we could be doing. And they didn't look at the Middle East and the refugees as bad or evil or terrorists. They saw it as people who just needed open arms. I think that travel is very easily a selfish thing. That's not bad, right? It's about you learning more about yourself or becoming bilingual or something. It's a bit self-centered in not a bad way. And I'd always seen sort of the things in my life as great opportunities for myself and as a way to better myself and to explore and to see. And I was so excited for my new job to get to travel because all the stamps in my passport and all this stuff. And I think that after Berlin, and even more so after going back to Missouri and seeing the story from Berlin touching someone's life there, I realized that travel's not about ourselves, but it's about how we pay forward sort of these experiences and these stories. In the same way that Ahmed sat there when we were 16, 17 years old and told me his story, a little story, and it sparked me doing what I ended up doing for my life. In the same way my friend Sarah told me about her dad. Like, those are smaller versions of stories, but it's how we break down sort of our stereotypes of others is by sharing. And I don't know if they did it just to be heard and to not feel alone, but the power of those men showing up was they broke down a lot of walls that they probably didn't even know existed by just being honest and sharing who they are. I think that we can change the world by sharing our stories.
Hey, it's Meg, the executive producer for EF Outbound, and I wanted to let you know that we're taking a short break to collect some more amazing stories and even live a few of our own. So sit tight, and we'll be back later this summer with Season 3. As always, if you have a transformative travel story you'd like to share with the team, email us at outbound@ef.com. EF Outbound is brought to you by EF Education First, the world leader in international education. This episode was hosted and produced by Shelby Elatmani with help from me, Meg Martineau, Ekwo Edzi, and Tucker Hamilton. The sound design is done by Billy Woraznik. To find out more information on EF or the podcast, head over to ef.com/podcast. And if you like what you heard in Season 2, we'd love it if you'd leave us a review in iTunes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.